In the last module, we looked at the various contact methods used in surveys. In this module, we will look at some of the sources of error that arise and their remedies. First, we need to understand what is meant by error in the context of a survey. Imagine that we were able to survey every member of some hypothetical target population, that is, conduct a census of the population. We would measure the variable of interest, for example, age, and then calculate a statistic such as the mean value of that variable. That would give us the population mean. This number would be the true value of the population's age. Let's say that we then took a sample from that population and measured the same variable for everyone in our sample. We would then calculate the corresponding sample statistic, in this case the sample mean. The difference between the two, the sample mean and the population mean, would represent the error in our sample statistic. The greater the discrepancy between the two values, the greater the error. This error can be thought of as being one of two types. The first is sampling error, which is inherent in drawing a sample. In other words, no matter how careful you are to draw a random representative sample, there will always be a discrepancy between the sample value and the population value, simply because you are excluding some part of the population from the sample. The magnitude of this error can be calculated from a statistical formula, so you know how accurate or how inaccurate your sample statistic is. The second type of error is systematic error, otherwise known as bias. This is a systematic, that is, non-random departure from the true value, which is not inherent in drawing a sample, but caused by flaws in the research methodology. This is by far the more serious problem because, unlike sampling error, it is not possible to estimate the magnitude of systematic error. In fact, it is usually difficult even to know if there is any systematic error present in the first place. The only thing you can do to guard against it is to identify ways in which the error can arise and use the appropriate methodology to try and minimize its impact. In the rest of this module, we will be concerned about systematic error, how it can arise, and what we can do about it. To understand the different sources of error, it is important to visualize the survey process as a series of stages. In the first stage, we draw a sample from the target population. In the second stage, we contact the sample using one of the methods discussed earlier. In the third stage, we ask respondents questions and record their responses. The very first source of error can arise in the first stage, if we fail to specify the target population correctly. For example, if our sample consists of people who are not the decision makers for the purchase of the product of interest, then we have the wrong population. Or if an educational institution wants to attract more applicants but surveys only its current applicants, this represents an error in the population specification. In order to understand the next source of error, we need to define the terms sampling unit, sampling frame, and sampling procedure. A sampling unit is a member of the target population. It is what you are drawing a sample of. For example, consumers, households, zip codes, companies, etc. A sampling frame is a list of sampling units, that is, a list of members of the target population. Finally, a sampling procedure is the method you use for drawing sampling units from the sampling frame. Sampling frame error, also known as non-coverage error, arises when the sampling frame excludes some of the target population members. For example, in the past, the phone book could be used as a sampling frame of telephone numbers in a city. Now, that is no longer the case, since it excludes cell phones. There are many other commercial sources of sampling frames that are used in market research. These include street directories, that is, known addresses in each zip code obtained from the US Postal Service, useful when you want to target a particular geographical area. Subscriber lists from magazines, which are often good for identifying people with a shared interest or lifestyle. Credit card holders, useful for identifying people who spend a certain amount on a specified product category. And list vendors who can supply lists based on profession or other criteria. A third source of error is selection error that arises from the sampling procedure. If we use a non-random sampling procedure, it is quite likely to lead to systematic error. The problem is especially acute when population members are allowed to self-select into a sample. That is, if they are included in the sample because of something they do or say. For example, most so-called opinion polls run by the media, CNN, Fox News, etc., are based on self-selected and unscientific samples, where viewers or listeners are invited to call a number or click a link to express their opinion. Clearly, only those with strong opinions, or at least strong enough opinions to take the trouble to vote, will be included in the sample. Remember the Daily Show segment on opinion polls mentioned in an earlier module? At the next stage of the survey process, contacting the sample, the method used to contact potential respondents can present a source of error. Each contact method will have certain strengths and weaknesses. Door-to-door interviewing, if you were to do it today, will result in highly skewed samples, and increasingly, so is the case with telephone interviewing as well. Depending on the target population, online or mobile surveys too can pose a risk of getting unrepresentative samples. Mall intercepts have their own limitations, as we discussed earlier. One simply has to be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of each method and choose the approach that, on balance, is most appropriate given the goals of the survey. One can and should collect the appropriate data from the sample to verify that it conforms to the characteristics of the target population. Since the latter is typically specified in terms of demographics, that means that questions on demographics or other relevant characteristics must be included in any survey. A second source of error at this stage can be the respondent's unwillingness to participate, which leads to non-response error. This type of error arises when there is a systematic difference between the respondents who participate and those who choose not to. For example, if only people who feel negatively about a product or issue respond, the results will be biased. Or if only people who have more time to respond, such as those who are unemployed or retired, obviously the sample will be biased. If this appears to be a problem, we can try to increase the response rate by offering incentives, by sending pre-survey letters urging people to participate, and by sending follow-up letters or calling to remind them to participate. How do we know whether non-response error is significant enough to skew the results? Unfortunately, there is no hard and fast rule, but the lower the response rate, the more likely there is to be non-response error. We can do a diagnostic check by comparing the sample characteristics with those of the target population. If there is a discrepancy, we clearly have a problem. However, keep in mind that the lack of a discrepancy does not necessarily indicate that there is no bias. Respondents with similar demographic profiles may differ on some other unobserved characteristic. Another way to verify the extent of non-response error is to try and get more people to participate who resemble non-respondents in terms of their demographic characteristics, usually by offering greater incentives. If this fails, a third way of dealing with this is to compensate for the group with a lower response rate by overweighting the responses at the data analysis stage. That is, giving them a higher weight. By doing so, at least in the aggregate, we are able to correct the imbalance to some degree. However, we don't have a way of knowing whether this is a good solution, since the missing respondents from that group may be different from the ones who did respond, even if they shared the same characteristics. At the last stage of the survey, when respondents are interviewed and the responses recorded, a number of errors can arise. While these can occur regardless of the contact method, they are most likely to occur when respondents are interviewed by phone or in person, because the face-to-face nature of the interview process exacerbates the problem. Prestige seeking, also known as social desirability bias, occurs when respondents try to look good in the eyes of the interviewer or try to conceal socially undesirable behavior or attitudes. The idea is that people are extremely reluctant to expose themselves to the risk of humiliation or shame, and so will often lie to avoid the risk. This type of error is likely to be greater to the extent that the interviewer is seen by the respondent as socially superior or different. For example, it is generally not a good idea to send male interviewers to interview female respondents and vice versa. Courtesy bias, also known as acquiescence bias, occurs when someone doesn't want to express a negative opinion about something to the interviewer. This is likely to occur when the respondent believes that the interviewer is looking for a positive response. This is a particular problem in some countries outside the US, where people are reluctant to say anything that might seem hurtful or disrespectful to the interviewer. However, this can be observed in polls in the US as well. For example, look up the Bradley effect in the link below the video. Auspices bias refers to the bias due to the respondent's attitude towards the sponsor of the study. If you, as a researcher, identify the sponsor, this will bring into play the respondent's attitude towards the sponsor. The attitude may be positive or negative, but in either case, it can influence the responses and create a bias. It can also lead to non-response error. So we generally do not identify the sponsor unless it is unavoidable. Interviewer error refers to biases created by untrained interviewers due to a failure to stick to the interview protocol, that is, the script. For example, if they try and explain or rephrase the question in their own words. Clearly, this can be a problem, especially if there are multiple interviewers all using their own words, in which case there will be multiple versions of the question being asked and it will be impossible to interpret the data. Response error refers to inaccurate responses given by respondents due to lack of thought, lack of information, inability to recall, or simply misunderstanding the question. This type of error is usually caused by poorly worded questions that don't take into account the respondent's difficulty in understanding and responding to the question. To conclude, these types of errors are mostly due to the interaction between the interviewer and the respondent at the interviewing stage. To the extent that this interaction can be carefully scripted, the questionnaire carefully pre-tested, and interviewers trained to be neutral and non-judgmental, these errors can largely be avoided. In fact, successful interviewing often requires that the interviewer be or appear to be as similar as possible to the respondent.